Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about Charity's bloody revolt in South Carolina that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled, and if this story truly captivates you. If it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. History doesn't always speak in the thunder of cannons or the grand pronouncements of kings. Sometimes, its truest voice is a whisper on the storm, a secret held in the heart of a single defiant soul. To hear it, you must listen past the official records, past the sanitized narratives, and tune your ear to the silence between the lines, to the stories that were never meant to be told. Our story tonight begins in such a silence, on a night when the heavens themselves seemed to roar in protest. In the autumn of 1861, as the United States tore itself asunder, South Carolina stood as the white-hot heart of the Confederacy, a land built on a foundation of human bondage. Here, tradition was a gilded cage, and honor was a currency paid for with the sweat and blood of others. On one particular October night, a tempest of biblical fury descended upon the region. It was a storm that clawed at the earth, lashing the fields with rain that fell like glass shards and wind that howled like a legion of grieving spirits. This was no ordinary weather. It was a reckoning. The sky, a canvas of bruised purple and violent black, was split open again and again by jagged veins of lightning, each flash a temporary, blinding judgment on the world below. And in one of those spectral flashes, for a single, frozen heartbeat, the truth of Rosewood Plantation was illuminated. Not the truth seen from the grand porch of the master's house, but the one hidden in the shadows behind it. There, standing motionless amidst the chaos, was a woman. Her name was Charity, and at 28 years old. The exhaustion etched into her face spoke of a lifetime far longer. She was not cowering from the storm, nor was she praying for it to end. She seemed, instead, to be a part of it, a calm, terrible eye in the center of the hurricane. In her hand, held not with aggression but with an unnerving, surgical stillness, was a carving knife. Its blade, meant for the master's table, caught the lightning's glare, shimmering with a cold, hungry light. Her eyes, fixed on the distant, flickering lamps of the great house, held no fear, no pleading. Only the profound and terrifying clarity of a decision from which there could be no return. In that singular, silent moment, an empire built on the fiction of absolute power began to crumble. It would not be felled by armies or by legislation, not yet. It would begin to die from within, poisoned by the very suffering it had created, its foundations irrevocably cracked by the quiet resolve of the woman it had sought to break. This is the story of that night, and of the 40 souls she would lead out of hell. It is a story of vengeance, of courage, and of a desperate, bloody bid for freedom, a story America has tried, for over a century, to forget. To understand the fire in her eyes, one must first understand the furnace that forged it, Rosewood, on a map. It was a profitable enterprise of sugarcane and cotton, but to the 100 souls who labored upon it, Rosewood was a living, breathing entity, a malevolent god whose moods dictated their very existence. A palpable weight settled upon the shoulders the moment one passed its iron gates, for the air itself seemed thick, heavy with the sweet, cloying scent of cane mingling with the metallic tang of sweat and the faint. ever-present odor of despair. Plantation ledgers from the era list Rosewood's assets in cold. Economic terms, acres, livestock, equipment. But they fail to capture its sound, the slow, rhythmic drag of chains at dawn. A sound that had become the plantation's true and terrible heartbeat. Located deep in the heart of South Carolina, miles from any significant town, Rosewood was a kingdom unto itself, isolated and absolute. This isolation was a tool, carefully cultivated by its master, Silas Bogard. It ensured his rule was law, and that the screams of his victims would be swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness surrounding them. By 1861, this isolation was compounded by a growing societal paranoia. The fever of secession had broken, and with the nation careening towards civil war, the grip of the slaveholding class tightened. Every whisper of abolition from the North was answered with a harsher lash in the South. Masters like Bogard saw rebellion in every shadow, conspiracy in every silent glance. Rosewood, once merely a place of brutal labor, had transformed into a fortress, a microcosm of the South's deepest fears and most savage cruelties. The geography of the plantation was a stark map of this power dynamic. At its heart stood the big house, a two-story mansion of whitewashed columns and sprawling verandas. It was a monument to stolen prosperity, its windows gleaming like vacant eyes, its gardens meticulously manicured into a state of unnatural perfection. From this porch, Silas Bogard could survey his domain. A modern-day pharaoh gazing upon the fields that fed his obscene wealth. The house was an illusion, a beautiful facade designed to conceal the rot within. Just beyond its manicured lawns, hidden by a line of weeping willows, lay the quarters. This was the antithesis of the big house, a collection of crudely built wooden shacks, weather-beaten and leaning as if exhausted by the suffering they contained. Here, there was no polished silver, only splintered wood, no crystal goblets, only cracked gourds. The path between the two worlds was short, yet it crossed a chasm of human experience wider than any ocean. It was a world of horrifying contrasts, the scent of lavender from the mistress's garden clashing with the stench of sickness from the infirmary shack, the sound of a pianoforte drifting from the parlor, mingling with the muffled sobs of a mother whose child had been sold away. This was the world that created charity. And within this carefully constructed hell, there were souls who refused to break. They learned to wear masks, to present a face of submission while a universe of defiance churned within. Charity was a master of this art. To Master Bogard, she was just another piece of property, efficient and silent. To Ward, the overseer, she was an object of his daily, casual cruelty. They saw her, but they did not see her. They failed to see the way she moved through her tasks with a chilling economy of motion, her mind a ceaseless engine of observation. They didn't see how, while chopping vegetables, her eyes would linger on the weight and balance of the cleaver, or how she had mentally inventoried every potential weapon in the kitchen, from cast-iron skillets to the long, sharp needles used for sewing. This was the first sign, a quiet, constant assessment of a prison, not as a place of confinement, but as a future battlefield. The second sign was in her gaze. For years, she had endured by retreating inward, by making herself small. But something had shifted. Now, when Ward loomed over her, his breath foul with liquor, she no longer dropped her eyes. She met his gaze. And in that silent confrontation, Ward, a man who thrived on fear, found none. He found something cold, ancient, and unyielding. It was a look that didn't challenge him, but simply dismissed him. It unnerved him in a way he could not articulate. A flicker of unease he would try to beat out of her later, only to find it looking back at him again, unchanged. The fire that had smoldered for a decade within her was now drawing air, burning away the fear and leaving only a hard, brilliant core of purpose. She was not alone. She was one point in a hidden constellation of defiance. There was Jonas, the blacksmith, his arms corded with muscle and scarred from the forge's fire. Master Bogard saw only a powerful tool for mending plows. He did not see the intelligence in Jonas's eyes, nor the way his hands, capable of shaping unyielding iron, could also work with delicate precision in the dead of night. Weakening a chain link or crafting a key from a stolen nail, his forge was a place of heat and violent transformation, and in its roaring heart, the tools of liberation were being conceived. And then there was Cora, an elder whose true age was a mystery, her back bent from a lifetime of labor, but her spirit unbowed. She was the keeper of memories, a living bridge to a past in Africa that most had been forced to forget. To the masters, she was a harmless, half-senile old woman, but to the enslaved community, she was a source of profound power. She knew the old ways, the secrets of root and leaf, which plants could heal and which could harm. Her whispers were not prayers for deliverance to a white man's god, but incantations of resilience, a quiet summoning of strength from the earth itself. It was she who saw the change in Charity first, who recognized the dangerous light of rebellion taking hold, and who would, when the time came, place the knowledge of generations into Charity's waiting hands. Together, these three, the strategist, the artisan, and the mystic, formed a trinity of hope in a godless place. Their silent understanding the first tremor of the earthquake to come. The catalyst arrived not as a whisper, but as a proclamation, slicing through the thick morning humidity with the authority of a freshly oiled whip. It was delivered by Ward himself, his silhouette framed against the rising sun as he sat astride his horse, a dark god surveying his grim creation. Master Silas Bogard, he announced, his voice dripping with a mockery of cheer, would be hosting his annual harvest feast for the opulent society of South Carolina. It was a coveted invitation, a night of bourbon-fueled laughter and genteel indulgence for the enslaved of Rosewood. The words landed like a death sentence. The feast was a season of its own, a period of intensified hell where the sun seemed to hang longer in the sky and the nights offered little respite. It meant fields to be cleared at double the pace, hogs to be slaughtered, barrels of cider to be hauled, and a mountain of culinary demands to be met, all culminating in the profound humiliation of preparing a banquet whose aromas would torture their empty stomachs. Yet, as the dreaded news rippled through the suffocating air of the quarters, something else followed in its wake, a current of unspoken, electric resolve. This year would be different. This year, the master's gluttony would not be a symbol of their subjugation, but the very stage for their liberation, for Charity, standing by the well with a bucket in hand. The proclamation was not a burden, but a sign, the abstract. Simmering hope for an opportunity had just been given a name and a date. The gears of her mind, already turning, now engaged with the definitive, terrifying click. That evening, as the last vestiges of daylight bled away, leaving the world in hues of bruised orange and purple, the first tangible move was made. Jonas entered the main kitchen, his massive frame filling the doorway. He carried an empty bucket, a plausible excuse to be near the hearth's water basin. Inside, Simon, the perpetually apoplectic cook, was already in a full-throated tirade about the injustice of having to procure figs of a certain size. His complaints a thick cloud of noise that provided the perfect camouflage. Jonas moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, his presence so common as to be invisible. He knelt by the hearth, his back to Simon, and as he reached for the ladle, his other hand moved. A small, heavy bundle, wrapped in greasy, nondescript cloth, was placed on the cool stones behind a stack of firewood. The transfer was silent, economical, a masterpiece of covert communication. No word was exchanged, no glance was shared. The act was as mundane as adding a log to the fire, and 1,000 times more significant. Moments later, as Simon turned to curse at a pot that was boiling too vigorously, Charity's hand darted out, retrieving the bundle and securing it deep within the folds of her dress. Its weight against her hip was a constant, physical reminder of the pact she had just made with their future. In the suffocating, shared darkness of her shack hours later, she finally unwrapped it. The cloth fell away to reveal the instruments of a miniature revolution, gleaming dully in the faint moonlight slanting through the cracks in the wall. A thin metal file, its teeth sharp and hungry, promised to devour the iron that bound them. A length of sturdy cord, coiled like a dormant serpent, held the potential for leverage and restraint. And finally, a small corked vial, no bigger than her thumb, containing a dark, viscous liquid. This was Cora's contribution, brewed from roots whose secrets were carried across an ocean in the memory of survivors. It was not a poison meant to kill, for a swift death was too merciful. It was a substance designed to steal a man's strength, to turn his blood to sludge and his mind to a thick, panicked fog. These were not mere objects. They were the physical manifestation of a choice. They were the answer to a prayer she had never dared to speak aloud. The final piece of this deadly puzzle was whispered into existence that same night, under a sliver of moon that offered more shadow than light. Charity found Cora sitting outside her shack, her form so still she seemed a part of the earth itself. She was humming a low, guttural tune, a melody that held the memory of another continent, of a life before chains. Charity knelt, her presence announced by the crunch of a single dry leaf. "The storm," Charity whispered, her voice barely disturbing the air. "It'll come." But when? Cora did not open her eyes, but her humming ceased, leaving a profound silence. For a long moment, she seemed to listen to something far beyond the chirping of crickets, to the rhythm of the world itself. Then, her voice, dry and raspy like autumn leaves, gave the reply that would become their covenant, their trigger, their sacred, terrifying prophecy. "3 thunders," she murmured, the words feeling ancient and heavy. "The night of the banquet, when the inevitable autumn storm made its pilgrimage from the coast. The third deafening clap of the thunder would be their signal to begin. It was a trigger only God could pull, a judgment from the heavens to sanctify their work on earth. The plot now had its form, its tools, and its ordained moment. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The days that followed became a symphony of silent, coordinated rebellion, a masterpiece of deception conducted in the spaces between words, in the language of shared glances and subtle gestures. On the surface, the brutal, monotonous rhythm of rosewood continued. The bells rang at the same ungodly hour. The sun was as unforgiving as ever, and Ward's lash still fell with vicious caprice. But underneath this familiar veneer of subjugation, a hidden world was teeming with purpose, an invisible network bound by generations of shared suffering, and a singular, desperate hope began to move as one. This secret war was fought in inches and ounces. It was fought by Ezekiel, the old man with eyes that had seen too much, while mending a fence near the livestock pens. He would spend a fraction too long studying the rusted hinges of a secondary gate. his gnarled fingers probing the corroded iron, his old eyes committing every weakness to a mental map of escape. It was fought by Ruth, a young mother whose every waking thought was for her children, while washing linens at the creek, her hands scrubbing furiously. She was also secretly sewing small, flat pouches into the linings of her family's garments, creating hidden compartments for a stolen biscuit, a strip of dried meat, a small bundle of medicinal herbs. Every stitch was a prayer for a future she could barely imagine. Each act was a defiant thread woven into a larger tapestry of freedom. Ben, the boy of 10 who could move with the ethereal silence of smoke, was given the most delicate of missions. He spent his afternoons near the cane shed, seemingly lost in the solitary games of a child. But his game was one of lethal calculus. He learned the patrol patterns of the junior overseers, timing them with the slow crawl of a shadow on the ground. He learned the precise angle and pressure needed to lift the shed's heavy iron latch without it uttering a single betraying groan. Practicing the motion for hours with a twig until his small hand and the imagined weight were one. The other children, too young to understand the specifics, but old enough to sense the shift in the air, learned a new, profound kind of silence. Their games became quieter, their eyes more watchful. They were all conspirators now, an army of whispers hiding in plain sight. This subtle seismic shift in the plantation's atmosphere did not go entirely unnoticed. Ward was a creature of brutal instinct, not intellect, and his instincts were screaming a silent alarm. He could not name the source of his mounting unease, but he felt it in his bones, a new stillness in the air. A different quality to the silence of the people he ruled through fear. It was in the way eyes that once held terror now held a disquieting blankness. A placid surface over unfathomable depths. He sensed a cohesion where before there had been only fractured, individual despair. His paranoia, a venomous thing, began to fester. In response, he did the only thing he knew. He escalated his cruelty. His violence became more erratic, his whip lashing out for imagined slights, his presence a constant, menacing shadow that could fall upon anyone at any time. He would single out Charity with a particular, obsessive focus, determined to crack the unnerving calm she now wore like impenetrable armor. He would stand too close, his voice a low poison, cataloguing the punishments he could inflict, searching her face for the flicker of fear he so desperately needed to see. "You think you're clever," he'd hiss, his breath foul. "But I see you. I see all of you." But he found nothing in her eyes. It was like staring into a deep well. He could see his own twisted reflection, but he had no idea of the crushing, cold darkness that lay beneath. The pressure was escalating, turning Rosewood into a powder keg where a single misstep could ignite an inferno. 2 days before the feast, the spark came from the most unexpected of sources. It was delivered not as a threat, but as an order from the big house, carried by a flustered house servant. Mistress Bogard, in a fit of pique over another servant who had fallen ill, had made a new arrangement. Charity, known for her steady hands and unobtrusive silence, was to be taken from the sweltering chaos of the kitchens. She would be serving at the master's own table on the night of the banquet. The news ripped through the hidden network with the force of a physical blow. Their entire plan hinged on Charity's position in the kitchen, a place of relative anonymity, a backstage area from which to act, to be brought into the lion's den, onto the main stage, under the direct, scrutinizing gaze of every master and overseer, was a catastrophic complication. For a few frantic hours, it seemed the plan was dead, strangled in its crib. But as Charity received the order, her face a perfect mask of impassivity, her mind was a whirlwind. The initial shock, a cold, sickening lurch in her stomach, gave way to a chilling, stunning realization. This was not a disaster. This was a realignment of fate. This was a far greater risk, but it was also a far greater, more intimate opportunity. The kitchen had offered her proximity. The dining hall offered her direct access. It meant she would be the one to pour the master's wine. The thought settled in her mind, cold and absolute, pushing aside all fear. The plan was not broken. It had just been honed to a finer, deadlier point. The night of the banquet arrived, cloaked in a suffocating humidity that promised violence. The sky to the west was a canvas of bruised, ominous purple. Holding its breath, far in the distance, a low, guttural rumble echoed across the fields, the first thunder. It was a sound no one in the big house noticed over the crescendo of their laughter and the clinking of crystal. But in the quarters, and in the heart of one woman, it landed like the tolling of a great iron bell. Charity moved through the gilded chaos of the dining hall like a phantom. She carried heavy silver trays of roasted pheasant and glazed ham. Her movements fluid and economical. She refilled crystal goblets with deep red wine. Her face a serene, blank canvas upon which the masters could project their own assumptions of her simplicity. All the while, she was a creature of pure, focused intent. She felt Ward's eyes on her, a physical weight of suspicion, but she never looked his way. Her world had shrunk to a single, pulsing point of focus, the ornate, high-backed chair at the head of the table, and the tyrant who sat in it. The opportunity came as the second course was being cleared. Simon, the cook, flustered and sweating, barked at her to fetch a specific bottle of aged claret from Silas Bogart's private reserve in the pantry. The pantry was a small, cool, silent room, a world away from the noise and heat of the feast. This was the moment. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the second thunder, which cracked much closer this time, sharp and sudden, rattling the jars of preserves on the shelves. Her hands, however, were perfectly steady. From the small pouch hidden deep in her dress, she took a measured pinch of the dark, powdered root Cora had given her, with a deft, practiced twist. She removed the heavy cork from the wine bottle. The air was still. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, a rushing sound like the sea. She let the powder fall into the dark red liquid. For a breathtaking moment, it sat on the surface like a tiny, dark island before being swallowed whole, vanishing without a trace into the depths. She swirled the bottle gently, once, twice. The wine's deep ruby color remained unchanged. Its rich aroma of berries and oak was the same, but it was no longer just wine. It had been transformed into an instrument of justice. She replaced the cork, smoothed her dress, and stepped back into the blinding light of the hallway, her face as serene and unreadable as ever. The covenant had been sealed. The point of no return had been crossed with an unshakable finality. All that was left now was to wait for the sky to pass its final, roaring judgment. The third thunderclap did not simply roll across the sky. It detonated. It was a singular, apocalyptic crack of sound that seemed to split the very firmament. A celestial axe blow that shook the foundations of the big house. Inside the dining hall, the crystal goblets on the long table trembled, their contents shivering as if in fear. The nervous laughter of the guests died in their throats, replaced by a sudden, unnerved silence. In that silence, another sound emerged, far smaller but infinitely more terrible, the scrape of a chair leg against the polished floor. All eyes turned to the head of the table. Silas Bogard was attempting to stand, but his body refused to obey. One hand gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, while the other clawed at the fine linen of his waistcoat, just over his heart. His face, moments before flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, had become a ghastly, ashen mask. His lips parted, but no words came out, only a low, strangled gasp, the sound of a man drowning on dry land. This was the first piece of irrefutable evidence the master of Rosewood, the embodiment of absolute power, was collapsing from within, his authority dissolving before the horrified eyes of his peers. For a moment, the room was a tableau of frozen panic. Forks hovered mid-air. Conversations hung, unfinished, in the suddenly cold air. Then, Ward's voice, raw and commanding, shattered the paralysis. "Get him to his chambers. Fetch the doctor." But as the guests surged to their feet, a new set of sounds began to intrude from the world outside, a counter-narrative to the drama unfolding within. First, a muffled, splintering crack from the direction of the cane shed the sound of a rusted lock giving way to Jonas's calculated force. It was a sound no one inside should have been able to hear over the pounding rain, but in the heightened tension of the room, it registered as a dissonant, inexplicable note. It was followed by something even more chilling, a human sound, not of alarm, but of a single, unified exhalation. The sound of 40 pairs of lungs taking their first breath of free, unmonitored air. This was the second piece of evidence, and it was undeniable. The Order of Rosewood, an order maintained for generations by whips and chains and to the systematic crushing of hope, was not just fraying at the edges, it was being actively, methodically dismantled in the storm-lashed darkness. The chaos inside the dining hall was no longer the main event. It was merely a diversion. Silas Bogard staggered, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly turning to terror. He knocked over his goblet, and the poison wine, the very agent of his downfall, spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, spreading like a mortal wound. Charity watched the stain grow, her face impassive, her heart a cold, steady drum. Let him drown in it, she thought. Ward, pushing through the panicked guests, finally reached his master's side, but as he tried to haul the heavy man toward the door, he glanced back into the room, his instincts screaming that the true threat was not his master's sudden affliction. And that is when he saw her. Amidst the chaos of screaming women and shouting men, Charity stood perfectly still, the silver tray still in her hand, alone, silent island in a sea of pandemonium. Her eyes were not on her dying master. They were fixed on him. And in that gaze, Ward saw everything. He saw the years of his own cruelty reflected back at him, not with fear, but with a terrifying, final judgment. The full, horrifying truth crashed down upon him in that instant. This was not a sudden illness. This was an attack. This was a rebellion. And she was its heart. You, he growled. The word a knot of dawning fury and disbelief, he let go of Silas, who crumpled to the floor. The master was forgotten. The real war was here. Charity's confession was not spoken. It was enacted with a deliberate, almost ceremonial grace. She let the heavy silver tray slip from her fingers. It hit the wooden floor with a deafening crash, a sound that momentarily silenced the room. The clatter was a punctuation mark, the end of one life and the beginning of another. In the ringing silence that followed, she turned to the sideboard, where the carving knife lay next to the remains of a roasted pheasant. Her hand closed around its handle. This was her testimony. This was the unveiling of the true and terrible nature of the night. Her years of silent suffering had finally found a voice, and it was the cold, sharp whisper of steel. The room gasped as one. The sight of an enslaved woman, armed and defiant, was a violation of the natural order so profound it bordered on the apocalyptic. Before Ward could lunge, before he could unleash the whip coiled at his belt, the back door of the dining hall burst open. Jonas stood there, a giant silhouette against the raging storm, his face grim, his clothes soaked. "It's open," he bellowed, his voice a thunderclap of its own. "Move now." The hall exploded into a maelstrom. The carefully constructed illusion of planter society disintegrated into its most primal elements, predator and prey, hunter and hunted. Ruth, her face a mask of terror and resolve, darted in, grabbing Charity's arm, pulling her toward the yard. Ezekiel appeared as if from the very shadows, ushering two small, terrified children ahead of him, his sharpened blade a glint of deadly light in the flickering candles. Ward roared and charged, but Jonas intercepted him, swinging a heavy iron ladle from the kitchen like a medieval mace. The two men crashed into the dining table with the force of colliding bulls, sending plates, crystal, and cooked meat flying through the air. Guests screamed, scrambling for the main door, trampling each other in their haste to escape the nightmare that had erupted in their midst. Charity ran. The rain struck her face like 1,000 tiny needles, cold and cleansing. The night air, thick with the smell of ozone and wet earth, was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. It was the air of freedom. She could see the others, dark shapes moving with a desperate, unified purpose, spilling into the sanctuary of the tall cane fields. Behind her, she heard Ward's enraged roar, but the storm swallowed his voice, rendering him powerless. Lightning split the sky again, a brilliant, strobing flash that illuminated the entire yard for a split second. In that flash, she saw two images that would be burned into her memory forever. Silas, crumpled and forgotten on the porch, his eyes glassy and vacant, and then the face of her people, turned toward the darkness ahead, their expressions a mixture of raw terror and fierce, unholy joy. She did not stop. Through the sucking mud, over the trampled grass, into the narrow path between the cane. She ran until the lights of the big house were just a hateful glow behind her. The blow had been struck. Now came the race to survive it. The immediate legal repercussion for their act of liberation was not a trial by jury, but a trial by ordeal. The law of the land was now the law of the hunt, as the escapees plunged deeper into the cane. The structured, man-made world of the plantation began to dissolve behind them. The neat rows of sugarcane gave way to the untamed wilderness, and the ground beneath their feet softened into a greedy, sucking muck. They had entered the domain of the great cypress swamp, a primordial world that operated by its own ancient rules. The air grew heavy, close and wet, thick with the smell of decay and rebirth. The swamp did not welcome them, but it offered them a chance. It swallowed sound, muffled scents, and confused trails. It was a place where one could disappear. Behind them, the response was swift and savage. Ward, his face bruised and bleeding from his clash with Jonas, rallied the remaining men. Historical accounts from similar uprisings of the period describe the incandescent rage of the slaveholding class when their authority was challenged. It was not merely about recapturing property. It was about reasserting a worldview, about violently stamping out the terrifying idea that the people they owned possessed a will of their own. Lanterns were lit, rifles were loaded, and most terrifying of all, the hounds were released. The fugitives heard them before they saw anything. a faint, mournful baying that carried on the wind, a sound that promised a relentless, tireless pursuit. The sound struck a primal fear in their hearts, a fear deliberately cultivated by the masters for generations. "They'll have dogs," Jonas murmured, his voice grim as he helped a child over a fallen log. "And riders." The swamp became their accomplice. Charity. Acting on an instinct she didn't know she possessed, led the way. She plunged into the shallow, black water at the edge of a channel, scooping up handfuls of thick, foul-smelling mud. "Cover yourselves," she commanded, her voice low and urgent. "The children, too. Cover everything." They obeyed without question, smearing the cold, wet earth over their arms, their faces, their clothes. It was a desperate baptism, an attempt to erase their human scent and replace it with the scent of the swamp itself. They were no longer field hands from Rosewood. They were becoming creatures of the muck and shadows. Ezekiel, his memory reaching back to stories his own grandfather had told of running, found a path of sorts, a narrow ridge of tangled cypress roots that rose just above the black water. They moved in single file, a silent, mud-caked procession of ghosts, the water on either side deep and still, hiding untold dangers. Snakes, gators, and the constant threat of a misstep that could lead to drowning. The baying of the hounds grew louder, closer. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. But then, from far behind them, came a sharp yelp of pain from one of the dogs, followed by the angry shouts of men. Jonas had set sharpened stakes, carried from the quarters, into the muck along their back trail. "Not enough to stop them," he had said, "but enough to make them bleed." It was a small victory, but it bought them precious minutes. They pushed deeper, the societal repercussions of their actions chasing them in the form of lantern lights that flickered between the ancient trees like malevolent will-o'-the-wisps. The hunt was a microcosm of the entire system. They were fleeing a small, heavily armed group of white men, empowered by law and custom, determined to run down and reclaim a larger group of unarmed people whose only crime was the desire to own themselves. But here, in the swamp, the rules were different. The hunters' boots, so effective on the packed earth of the plantation, sank deep into the mire. Their horses were useless, their lanterns cast deceptive, dancing shadows. Here, the fugitives, with their knowledge of the earth and their desperation fueling them, had a fighting chance. They reached a small island of tangled roots and collapsed, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, the howls of the hounds still echoing in the oppressive, wet air. The hunt was not over. It had only just begun. For days that bled into one another, the swamp was their entire universe. Time lost its meaning, measured not in the passage of the sun, but in the proximity of the hounds baying, the depth of the water, and the gnawing ache of hunger. The initial adrenaline of the escape had long since evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the dull, constant thrum of fear. They were no longer running. They were enduring, a desperate, mud-caked tribe moving through a liquid purgatory. The world of Rosewood, with its structured cruelty, seemed a lifetime away, replaced by a different kind of tyranny, the tyranny of survival. The collapse of their old world was complete, but the shape of a new one had yet to form. It was the smell that found them first, not the familiar scent of wood smoke from the plantation's kitchens, but something thinner. Wilder, the smell of a fire, kept small and cautious. It was a human scent in a place that had seemed devoid of all humanity but their own. Ben, their young scout, was the first to see it. He returned from a forward patrol, his eyes wide not with fear, but with a disbelieving awe. He spoke in a hushed whisper of low huts woven from cypress and palmetto fronds. so perfectly integrated into the landscape they seemed to have grown there. He spoke of seeing people, men and women, moving with a quiet, watchful purpose that was neither the panicked haste of the hunted nor the arrogant stride of the hunter. Led by Ezekiel, who held his hands up in a universal sign of peace, they approached the perimeter of the hidden settlement. A shadow detached itself from the trees. An arrow knocked and aimed squarely at Ezekiel's chest. This was a maroon community, a ghost society comprised of escaped slaves and their descendants. A testament to the indomitable will to live free, even if it meant living on the absolute fringes of existence. Historical records of the period are filled with panicked reports from planters about these hidden communities, which they viewed as a cancer in the heart of their society, a constant, living incitement to rebellion. Their welcome was not warm. It was a cautious, pragmatic assessment of risk. The leader, a woman with eyes as sharp and ancient as flint, listened to Charity's story, not with sympathy, but with a cold, calculating gaze. "You do not just bring yourselves," the woman said, her voice low and steady. "You bring a trail. You bring the memory of your scent to the dogs. You bring the fury of the men who will not stop until they have reclaimed their property." This was the painful redefinition of their struggle. They had won their freedom from Rosewood, but in doing so, they had become a contagion, a threat to the fragile peace of this hidden sanctuary. They were no longer just fugitives. They were a liability. They were granted a temporary, conditional asylum. Their presence in the camp a constant, unspoken tension. The 40 runaways from Rosewood brought with them new hands to work, but they also brought 40 new mouths to feed, and, most dangerously, the undivided attention of the world they had just escaped. The collapse of their life at Rosewood had not led to immediate liberty, but to a new, more complex form of imprisonment, where the walls were made not of wood and iron, but of the ever-present threat of discovery. The blow that shattered this fragile peace came just as a semblance of routine had begun to form. It came in the form of a prisoner, dragged into the center of the camp by 2 grim-faced scouts. He was one of Ward's men, a junior overseer captured snooping at the ridgeline. His face was bloody, but his eyes burned with a defiant, triumphant malice. He spat a wad of blood onto the dirt at the elder's feet. "They're coming," he sneered, the words a death knell for the community's secrecy. "Ward, Pike, and a whole militia besides. They lost your trail in the water, but they never stopped looking." He then looked directly at Charity, a cruel smile twisting on his lips. "And they know your name?" The name hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Charity. It was no longer the name of a woman. It was the name of a rebellion, a symbol, a target. The camp, which had been a haven of quiet defiance, was instantly transformed into a fortress preparing for a siege. The redefinition was now complete. They were no longer running from slavery. They were now standing to fight for freedom. The legacy of that night is not written in any official history book. It does not exist in the state archives of South Carolina. It is a ghost story, a haunting, a chilling silence in the historical record where a great and terrible noise should be. The battle for the Maroon Camp was not a battle of armies, but a desperate, brutal, close-quarters struggle fought in the flickering firelight and the deep, primordial darkness under the cypress canopy. It was a fight to defend not just lives, but an idea, the idea that a people could carve out a space of freedom in a world determined to enslave them. As the first baying of the hounds echoed through the pines, a cold, methodical purpose settled over the camp. There was no panic, only the grim efficiency of people for whom survival was a daily practice. Jonas, the blacksmith, became their engineer of war, directing the placement of sharpened stakes and tripwires along the narrow approaches. Cora, the elder, moved among the defenders, not with weapons, but with handfuls of dried herbs and powders. She scattered a particular mixture into the flames of the central fire, releasing a thick, acrid smoke that twisted into the night air, a chemical weapon designed to confuse the sensitive noses of the hounds. Ben and the other young boys, with their intimate knowledge of the surrounding terrain, became a silent, invisible network of scouts, their whispered reports providing the defenders with a crucial advantage. Ward's voice bellowed from the darkness, a crude attempt at psychological warfare. Charity, give yourself up, and I might let the rest of these animals live. No one answered. The only reply was the sudden, sharp howl of a hound that had run afoul of one of Jonas's snares. The militia charged, their confidence born of a lifetime of assumed superiority. They were met not with a terrified rabble, but with a coordinated, ferocious defense. The fight devolved into a series of desperate, individual duels in the shadows. Jonas met Ward in the open, his makeshift iron poker clashing against the overseer's whip and long knife in a shower of sparks. It was a battle of titans, brute force against brutal skill. Elsewhere, Harland Pike, the rifleman, tried to pick off defenders from a distance, but the shifting, deceptive light and the disciplined tactics of the Maroons made it impossible. He fired his rifle, the shot tearing a chunk of bark from a tree just beside Charity's head. And then she was on him. She moved low and fast, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. She didn't scream or shout. Her blade, the same carving knife from the big house, flashed in the firelight. The look in her eyes told Pike everything he needed to know. This was not vengeance for one night of terror, but for a lifetime of it. The hunters, who had expected to crush a simple slave revolt, found themselves in a guerrilla war they were completely unprepared for. They were fighting not just people, but the swamp itself. The defenders used the terrain, the darkness, and their desperation as weapons. The tide of the battle turned. Ward, dazed and bleeding from a blow that had shattered his jaw, finally bellowed the order for a retreat. The remaining militiamen scrambled back into the darkness, dragging their wounded, leaving behind the bodies of their dead. When the last of their lantern lights disappeared over the ridge, the camp was still. The defenders stood among the broken branches and the bodies of their enemies, breathing hard, their forms wreathed in the lingering smoke. They had won. They had held the line. But the diabolical legacy of the attack was its success. They had repelled the hunters, but in doing so, they had confirmed the camp's existence. It was no longer a secret. It was a known location, a marked target on the slaveholders' map. The elders knew they could not stay. The victory was also a death sentence for their home. The haunting question that history leaves unanswered is what happened next. Did the community scatter, breaking into smaller groups to vanish once more into the vast wilderness? Did they travel north, seeking the promise of the Union lines, a perilous journey of hundreds of miles, or did they stay and fight, eventually overwhelmed by a larger, more organized force? The records are silent. The fate of Charity, Jonas, Cora, and the 37 others from Rosewood is lost to time, a secret the swamp has kept to this day. And so, we're left at the edge of that dark water, staring into a history that is incomplete, a story without a final chapter. The tale of Charity's revolt is more than just an account of a forgotten uprising. It is a profound and disturbing meditation on the very nature of justice and the writing of history. What does it mean when the only path to freedom requires an act of terrible violence? Can a system built on institutionalized brutality ever be dismantled by peaceful means? Charity's actions on that stormy night were, by the laws of a time, the gravest of crimes. Yet, viewed through the lens of human dignity, were they not the ultimate assertion of justice? Her story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that history is not a passive record of events, but an active, often brutal, process of selection. It is a narrative shaped by power, written by the victors, and curated to uphold the myths upon which societies are built. For every hero whose name is carved in stone, there are 1,000 heroes like Charity, whose names were deliberately erased, their stories buried under the foundations of a more convenient truth. Their silence is a testament to the fear they inspired. Their absence from the official record is, perhaps, the most powerful evidence of their existence. The enduring warning of Rosewood is that the most dangerous ghosts are not the spirits of the dead, but the forgotten stories of the oppressed. They linger in the margins, in the whispers, in the silences, waiting. They remind us that systems of power built on dehumanization are inherently unstable, that the human spirit can be caged but never truly tamed, and that somewhere, even now, in the darkest corners of our world, a fire is being banged, a blade is being sharpened, and a storm is gathering, waiting for the third thunder to strike